The rain came down in sheets that night, cold and merciless, turning the asphalt into mirrors that reflected the neon signs of the roadside bar. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the weathered wooden door, her hands trembling not from the cold but from something far deeper, something that had been eating away at her soul for weeks now. Inside that bar were men that most people crossed the street to avoid, men whose leather vests bore patches that warned the world to keep its distance. But Sarah had run out of options, run out of hope, run out of time. Her daughter Emma, just 7 years old with eyes like summer skies and a laugh that used to fill their small apartment with joy, was lying in a hospital bed 18 miles away, her small body failing, her time measured not in years or months, but in days, perhaps hours. The doctors had done everything they could, they said, their voices heavy with professional sympathy that did nothing to fill the hollow space in Sarah's chest. Emma needed a treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, a specialist that didn't take their plan, a chance that cost more money than Sarah had seen in her entire life. She had begged, borrowed, and sold everything she owned. She had stood on street corners with a donation jar, her pride dissolving with each passing car that didn't stop. She had called every charity, every foundation, every distant relative who might have $1 to spare. And still, she was $50,000 short. $50,000 might as well have been $50 million. So now she stood here, outside a bar called the Iron Horse, where the parking lot was filled with motorcycles that gleamed even in the rain, their chrome catching the light like promises or threats. Sarah had heard the stories everyone had. The Hells Angels weren't charity workers or social services. They were outlaws, men who lived by their own code, who answered to no authority but their own. But she had also heard other stories, whispered ones, about how they sometimes helped their own, how loyalty meant something to them that it didn't mean to the rest of the world. And Sarah had one connection, tenuous as a spider's thread. Her late father had once known a man named Garrett, had served with him in Vietnam, had saved his life in a firefight outside Da Nang. Garrett was inside that bar right now, and Sarah was about to walk through that door and beg for a miracle from men who didn't believe in them. Her hand reached for the door handle, and she felt the cold metal beneath her palm. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was her last chance. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The noise hit her first, a wall of sound that was laughter and music and the clink of glasses, the rumble of deep voices telling stories that probably shouldn't be repeated. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of beer and leather, and every eye in the place turned toward her as the door swung shut behind her. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, a deer that had wandered into a den of wolves. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted, became watchful. She was out of place here in her worn jeans and rain-soaked jacket, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. She clutched her purse against her chest like a shield and scanned the room, looking for a face she had only seen in a photograph yellowed with age. And then she saw him. Garrett was older now, his beard shot through with silver, his face mapped with lines that spoke of roads traveled and battles fought. He sat at a corner table with 3 other men, all of them wearing the same leather vest with the same winged skull patch that marked them as members of something most people feared. When his eyes met hers, there was a flicker of recognition, or maybe confusion, and then he was standing, moving toward her with the careful gait of a man whose body remembered injuries from long ago. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was gravelly, but not unkind. Up close, she could see the tattoos that crawled up his neck, the scars that marked his knuckles. But she could also see something in his eyes that gave her the courage to speak. "Are you Garrett?" Garrett Wade. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, nearly swallowed by the noise around them. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Depends on who's asking." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room upon her. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. My father was Thomas Mitchell. You served with him in Vietnam. He talked about you, about what you did for him at Da Nang." Something shifted in Garrett's face, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of his lips. "Tommy Mitchell's girl?" His voice dropped lower, became almost reverent. "Jesus, I heard he passed a few years back. I'm sorry. Your old man was one of the good ones. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes unbidden, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. He always said you save his life. He said if I ever needed anything, really needed anything, you were a man who paid his debts. She saw wariness creep into his expression now, a closing off, and she knew she had only seconds before he shut her out completely. I need help, Mr. Wade. My daughter is dying. The words hung in the air between them, raw and desperate, and Sarah watched as Garrett's face changed again, became harder and softer at the same time. He glanced back at his table, at the men who were watching this exchange with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Then he looked back at her. Come on, he said, gesturing toward an empty table near the back. Let's talk. As they walked through the bar, Sarah was acutely aware of the silence that followed them, the way conversations stopped and started again in their wake. She sat down across from Garrett, and he signaled to the bartender for 2 drinks she didn't want but knew better than to refuse. When the whiskey arrived, amber liquid in smudged glasses, Garrett pushed one toward her and said, Tell me. So she did. The words came tumbling out, a flood she couldn't have stopped if she wanted to. She told him about Emma, about her beautiful little girl who loved drawing and hated broccoli, who wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, who still believed in magic and fairy tales. She told him about the day Emma had fainted at school, about the tests and the diagnosis that had felt like a death sentence. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctors called it a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. They had started treatment immediately, chemotherapy that made Emma's hair fall out and her skin turn the color of old paper. For a while it had worked. The cancer had gone into remission, and Sarah had dared to hope, dared to believe that they had beaten it. But cancer doesn't always stay beaten. 3 months ago, Emma had relapsed, and this time the cancer was more aggressive, more resistant to treatment. The doctors recommended a new therapy, a combination of targeted drugs and immunotherapy that showed promise but wasn't widely available yet, wasn't covered by their insurance, cost a fortune that families like Sarah's simply didn't have. Without it, the doctor said, Emma had maybe 2 months. With it, she had a chance. Not a guarantee, not a sure thing, but a chance. And for a chance, Sarah would do anything, risk anything, beg from anyone. She told Garrett about the fundraising that had fallen short, about the doors that had closed in her face, about the bureaucratic nightmare of medical billing and insurance denials. She told him about sitting by Emma's bedside last night, holding her small hand while her daughter slept fitfully, her breath shallow, her skin hot with fever. Emma had opened her eyes at one point, looked at her mother with a clarity that seemed beyond her years, and whispered, It's okay, Mama. I'm not scared. But Sarah was scared. Sarah was terrified. And that terror had driven her here, to this bar, to this man, to this impossible ask. When she finished, there was silence. Garrett sat back in his chair, his whiskey untouched, his expression carved from stone. Sarah couldn't read him, couldn't tell if he felt pity or contempt or nothing at all. The seconds stretched into eternities, and she felt her hope begin to crumble, felt the walls closing in. Then Garrett spoke, his voice low enough that she had to lean forward to hear him. How much do you need? The question was so unexpected that Sarah almost didn't believe she had heard it correctly. $50,000, she whispered. The treatment center requires half up front, and the hospital needs the rest guaranteed before they'll start. Garrett's jaw tightened, and he glanced back at his table again, at the men who were now openly watching them. That's a lot of money. Sarah's heart sank. Of course it was too much. What had she been thinking? These men didn't know her, didn't know Emma. Why would they help? But then Garrett stood up, and he said, Wait here. He walked back to his table, and Sarah watched as he bent down and spoke quietly to the other men. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she saw their reactions, saw heads turn toward her, saw expressions range from skeptical to sympathetic. One man, heavy-set with a beard that reached his chest, shook his head and said something sharp. Another, younger with eyes that looked like they had seen too much too soon, leaned forward and responded. The conversation went back and forth, voices rising and falling, and Sarah felt like she was watching her daughter's life being debated by strangers. Finally, Garrett straightened up and walked back toward her, but he wasn't alone. The three other men from his table followed him, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They surrounded her, these large men in leather and denim, and for a moment she felt a spike of fear. But Garrett's voice was gentle when he spoke. "Sarah, these are my brothers. This is Bear, Smokey, and Trick. We've ridden together for 20 years. We've bled together, and we take care of our own." Bear, the heavy-set man who had been shaking his head, looked at her with eyes that were surprisingly kind. "Garrett says your old man saved his life. That means something. That means your family, whether you knew it or not." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, unchecked, unashamed. "I don't know what to say." Smokey, the younger one, crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "You don't have to say anything, but we need to know everything. Hospital name, treatment center, costs, timeline. We need details." Sarah nodded frantically, pulling crumpled papers from her purse, printouts from the hospital, letters from the insurance company, quotes from the treatment center. She spread them on the table like evidence at a trial, and the four men examined them with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. Trick, who had been silent until now, a lean man with scars on his arms that looked like burns, picked up one of the papers and read it carefully. "This treatment center is in California." Sarah nodded. They're one of only 3 facilities in the country approved for this therapy. The others have waiting lists that are months long. Emma doesn't have months. Garrett looked at his brothers, and something passed between them, a communication that needed no words. Then he turned back to Sarah. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to make some calls. We know people who owe us favors, people who have money and might be willing to help. We're also going to reach out to other chapters, see what we can pull together. But I need you to understand something." He leaned forward, his voice hard now, demanding her full attention. "We're going to try, Sarah. We're going to try like hell. But I can't promise you anything. $50,000 is a lot of money, and we might not be able to raise it all. We might not be able to raise it in time." Sarah wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Anything you can do, anything at all, I'll be grateful for the rest of my life." Bear put a massive hand on her shoulder, gentle despite its size. "How long do we have?" Sarah's voice broke. "The doctor said if we can't start treatment within the next week, Emma's organs will start to fail. After that, it won't matter how much money we have." The words hung in the air like a countdown, and Sarah saw determination harden in the faces around her. These men, these outlaws, these people that society wrote off as criminals and troublemakers, were her daughter's last hope. Garrett pulled out his phone and started making calls right there, walking toward the door where the reception was better. Bear grabbed a notebook from behind the bar and started writing down information, contacting people whose names Sarah didn't recognize. Smokey and Trick talked in low voices, planning something she couldn't quite hear. And Sarah sat at that table in a bar full of strangers and let herself cry, let herself feel the weight of hope that was almost more painful than despair, because hope meant there was still something to lose. The next few hours blurred together. More members of the motorcycle club arrived, summoned by phone calls and text messages, until the bar was packed with leather-clad men and women who all seemed to know why they were there. Someone brought Sarah coffee and a sandwich she couldn't eat. Someone else gave her a dry jacket. And the whole time, she watched these people work, watched them organize with military precision, watched them pore over her daughter's medical records and make calls and send messages. A woman named Raven, her arms covered in colorful tattoos, sat down next to Sarah and took her hand. "I have a daughter too," she said quietly. "She's 15 now, healthy, thank God. But I remember when she was in the hospital with pneumonia when she was 3. I remember thinking I would give anything, do anything to make her better. I understand." Sarah squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As the night wore on, Garrett kept coming back to update her. They had raised $5,000 from members' personal funds. They had called in a favor from a businessman who owed the club and gotten another $10,000. They had reached out to other chapters across the state, and promises were starting to come in. But the clock was ticking, and the total was still far short of what they needed. At some point, Sarah must have fallen asleep, because she woke with her head on her arms at the table, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The bar was quieter now, Only a dozen people left, but they were still working. Garrett saw her stir and came over. "What time is it?" she asked groggily. 3 in the morning. "You should go home, get some sleep." Sarah shook her head. "I need to get back to the hospital. Emma will wake up soon, and I want to be there." Garrett nodded. "Trick will give you a ride. But Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell Emma that a lot of people are fighting for her. I need you to tell her to hang on." Sarah looked into his weathered face and saw something there that took her breath away. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, had tears in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Because your father saved my life in a jungle half a world away when he didn't have to. Because we all have people we've lost, people we couldn't save. And because that little girl deserved a chance to grow up and hate broccoli and become a veterinarian." He smiled then, a sad smile that held decades of pain and loss. "And maybe because doing the right thing is what separates us from who people think we are." Trick drove her back to the hospital on his motorcycle, the city lights blurring past them in the pre-dawn darkness. When they arrived, he didn't just drop her off. He parked, took off his helmet, and walked her to the entrance. "We're not giving up," he said before he left. "Tell your little girl we're not giving up." Sarah rode the elevator to the pediatric oncology ward, her heart heavy with exhaustion and a hope that felt fragile as spun glass. She walked past the nurse's station where the night shift staff gave her sympathetic looks, past the rooms where other children fought their own battles, until she reached Emma's room. Her daughter was asleep, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, keeping watch over her fading life. Sarah sat down in the chair beside the bed, took Emma's hand in hers, and began to pray to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Over the next 3 days, Sarah lived between the hospital and her phone. Garrett called her every few hours with updates. The motorcycle club had organized a massive fundraiser, a charity ride that would cover 3 states. Members from chapters she had never heard of were contributing. Local businesses that the club patronized were donating. Even some of the bar regulars, people who barely scraped by themselves, were throwing in what they could. The total crept upward, 20,000, 25,000, 35,000. But time was running out faster than money was coming in. Emma's condition worsened. Her fever spiked, and the doctor started talking about organ function and making her comfortable. Sarah knew what that meant. They were preparing her to say goodbye. On the 4th night, Sarah sat in Emma's room, holding her daughter's hand and singing softly the lullabies she had sung when Emma was a baby. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing labored, her skin like parchment. The doctor had told Sarah that morning that they had maybe 48 hours left. The treatment center in California had called to say they were sorry, but without the full payment guaranteed, they couldn't hold the slot any longer. Sarah had thanked them politely and hung up, and then screamed into a pillow until her throat was raw. She had failed. Despite everything, despite all the help, despite the miracle of strangers who had fought for them, she had failed. Her daughter was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was still sitting there, tears streaming down her face, when her phone rang. It was almost midnight. She considered not answering, but something made her pick up. "Sarah." It was Garrett's voice, but there was something different about it, something she couldn't quite identify. "Yes." Her voice was hollow, defeated. "We did it." Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" "We did it. We have the full 50,000. Actually, we have 52,000. The last few contributions came in an hour ago. We did it." Sarah couldn't breathe. The room spun around her. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Garrett's laugh came through the phone, rough with emotion. "I'm sure. I'm looking at the bank account right now. The money's there, Sarah. All of it. We can wire it to the treatment center first thing in the morning." Sarah dropped the phone and let out a sob that came from the deepest part of her soul. Emma's eyes fluttered open, confused, frightened by the sound. "Mama? Why are you crying?" Sarah grabbed her daughter's face in her hands, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her nose. "Because sometimes miracles happen, baby. Sometimes angels wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles." She picked up the phone again, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. "Garrett, I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to ever repay this." His voice was gentle. "You don't have to repay it. You just have to make sure that little girl gets better. You just have to let her grow up and live the life she's supposed to live. That's payment enough." Over the next few hours, Sarah made the call she had been afraid to hope she could make. She called the treatment center and told them the money was coming. She called Emma's doctor and told her they needed to arrange transport to California as soon as Emma was stable enough to travel. She called her sister and told her to pack bags because they were going to California. And she called Garrett back and asked him if he would come to the hospital in the morning because she wanted Emma to meet the man who had saved her life. When Garrett arrived the next day, he didn't come alone. A dozen members of the motorcycle club came with him, filling the pediatric ward with leather and denim and the smell of the open road. The nurses looked alarmed at first, but when they saw the teddy bears and balloons and gifts the bikers had brought, their expressions softened. Emma was awake when they came in her room, propped up on pillows, her eyes wide with wonder at the sight of these large, intimidating men who had suddenly invaded her space. Garrett approached slowly, carefully, like he was afraid he might break her. "Hi, Emma. My name is Garrett. I was a friend of your grandpa's." Emma studied him with the serious expression children sometimes have, weighing and measuring. "Mama says you helped us. She says you're a hero." Garrett's face crumpled for just a moment before he composed himself. "No, sweetheart. Your mama's the hero. We just helped a little bit." Emma shook her head, as certain as only a 7-year-old can be. "Mama says angels come in all kinds of shapes. She says sometimes they ride motorcycles." Bear, standing behind Garrett, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Raven pulled out her phone and took pictures. And Sarah watched as these hardened outlaws, these men and women who had lived rough lives and made hard choices, gathered around her daughter's bed and made her laugh with stories and magic tricks and promises that when she got better, they would take her for a ride on a motorcycle. 3 days later, Sarah and Emma boarded a medical transport plane to California. The treatment center had confirmed receipt of the funds and had a bed waiting. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, careful not to make promises but willing to offer hope. As the plane lifted off, Sarah looked out the window at the city, falling away below them, and thought about the bar she had walked into on that rainy night, about the desperate plea she had made, about the strangers who had become family. She thought about Garrett, who had honored a debt from a war fought decades ago. She thought about all the members of the motorcycle club who had given money they probably needed themselves. She thought about the charity ride that had covered 3 states, hundreds of motorcycles roaring down highways for a little girl most of them would never meet. And she thought about how sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, how grace can wear leather and tattoos, how the people society fears might be the very ones who save you when no one else will. Emma squeezed her hand and said, "Mama, when I get better, can we go back and see Garrett and his friends?" Sarah smiled through her tears. "Baby, we're going to see them as often as they'll let us. They're family now." The treatment was hard, harder than anything Emma or Sarah had endured before. There were days when Sarah wondered if they had made the right choice, days when Emma was so sick from the therapy that she couldn't eat or sleep or do anything but cry. But there were also days when Emma felt good enough to draw pictures, days when her count improved, days when the doctors used words like responding and promising. And through it all, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from the motorcycle club. Garrett checked in every day. Raven sent care packages. Bear called to tell Emma jokes. Smokey organized another fundraiser to help with their living expenses in California. They had saved Emma's life with their money, but they continued to save it with their presence, their support, their refusal to let Sarah and Emma face this fight alone. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the parking lot of the Iron Horse again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Emma stood beside her, holding her hand, her hair growing back in soft brown curls, her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with life. The cancer was in remission again, and this time the doctors were using words like durable and long-term. Emma was going home. Sarah pushed open the door to the bar, and the noise washed over them again. But this time, when every eye turned toward them, Sarah didn't feel afraid. She felt like she was coming home. Garrett saw them first. and a shout of joy brought everyone to their feet. Emma. The entire bar erupted in cheers as the little girl walked across the room, shy but smiling, until she reached Garrett. He knelt down, so he was at her level, and Emma threw her arms around his neck. "I told you I'd come back," she said. "I told you I'd get better." Garrett held her tight, this grizzled warrior who had seen combat and violence and death, and he wept openly, unashamed. "You sure did, sweetheart. You sure did." That night, the bar threw a party the likes of which it had never seen. There was music and laughter and food, and Emma sat at a table surrounded by bikers who treated her like a princess, like a miracle, like hope made flesh. Sarah watched her daughter glow under the attention, watched her talk animatedly with Raven about the drawing she had made in the hospital, watched her giggle when Bear pretended to pull a quarter out of her ear. And she thought about that terrible night when she had walked through those doors with nothing left but desperation. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how a group of strangers had reached out and pulled her back from the edge. Garrett sat down beside her, nursing a beer, watching Emma with a smile on his face. "Thank you," Sarah said for the 1,000th time. "Thank you for saving her." Garrett shook his head. "Your old man saved me first. I was just evening the score." Sarah looked at him seriously. "No, what you did went beyond any debt. What you all did was pure grace." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Emma laugh as Trick showed her pictures of his motorcycle. Then Garrett said, "You know what the best part is? Emma's going to grow up. She's going to have a life, a full life. She's going to fall in love and have her heart broken and go to college and maybe become that veterinarian she talks about. She's going to have all of it, all the messy, beautiful, painful, wonderful parts of being alive. And every single day, every single moment of that life, it's a victory. It's a middle finger to the universe that tried to take her too soon." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I want her to remember this. I want her to remember that when things seemed darkest, people showed up. Strangers became family. Bikers became angels." Garrett smiled. "She'll remember. And maybe someday, when she's all grown up and someone needs help, she'll remember what was done for her, and she'll be the one who shows up." As the party continued around them, Sarah felt something settle in her chest, something that had been tight and anxious for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. It was peace. It was gratitude. It was the knowledge that even in a world that could be cruel and random and unfair, there was also this: people who cared, people who fought, people who refused to give up on a little girl they didn't know, because somewhere in a jungle decades ago, someone had refused to give up on them. Emma ran over to her mother, her face flushed with happiness. "Mama, can we come back here? Can this be our place?" Sarah looked around at the bar full of bikers, at Garrett and Bear and Raven and Smokey and Trick and all the others who had become her unlikely, impossible, beautiful family. "Yes, baby," she said, pulling her daughter close. "This is our place. These are our people. Always." And as the night wore on and the music played and Emma danced with her biker guardians, Sarah Mitchell finally understood what her father had tried to tell her all those years ago. He had said that Garrett was a man who paid his debts, but it was more than that. He was a man who understood that being human meant showing up for each other, even when it was hard, even when it cost something, even when the person you were helping was a stranger. That night in the hospital, when Emma had opened her eyes and said she wasn't scared, Sarah had been terrified enough for both of them. But sitting here now, watching her daughter laugh and dance and live, Sarah finally understood that fear had been transformed into something else: faith. Faith that sometimes, when you reach out into the darkness, someone reaches back. Faith that miracles can come in the form of leather jackets and motorcycles. Faith that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. Emma would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of her life, both physical and emotional. But she would also carry the memory of being saved, of being loved by strangers, of learning that family is not just blood but choice, not just genetics but grace. And Sarah would spend the rest of her life making sure her daughter knew how many people had fought for her, how many people had believed in her, how many people had looked at a desperate mother in a rain-soaked jacket and decided that this was the moment to show up, to be counted, to make a difference. The Hells Angels had a reputation, and most of it was earned through decades of living outside society's rules. But on that rainy night, when Sarah Mitchell walked through their door with nothing but hope and desperation, they had shown her another side, a side that understood loyalty and honor and the simple truth that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is help someone who has no way to repay them. As the party wound down and Emma started to yawn, Garrett walked them out to Sarah's car. The rain had returned, gentle this time, washing the streets clean. "Drive safe," he said, hugging them both. "And Sarah, your old man would be proud of you, of how you fought for your girl." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror and saw Garrett standing in the parking lot, watching them go, surrounded by his brothers and sisters who had rallied to save a stranger's child. And she knew that no matter what came next, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she and Emma would never face them alone. They had found their tribe, their family, their angels in leather. And that, Sarah thought as Emma dozed in the passenger seat beside her, was the real miracle. Not just that her daughter had been saved, but that they had been found by people who understood that the greatest rebellion against a cold and indifferent world is to love fiercely, to care deeply, and to show up when someone needs you, no matter who they are or where they come from. Emma would live. She would grow up. She would have her chance at life. And every single day of that life would be a testament to the power of human kindness, to the strength of community, to the truth that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who save us. The rain continued to fall as they drove through the night toward home, washing away the past and making way for the future, a future that had almost been stolen but had been given back by strangers who became family, by outlaws who became saviors, by men and women who wore leather and rode motorcycles and understood that the greatest thing a person can do is fight for someone who cannot fight for themselves. And somewhere behind them, in a bar called the Iron Horse, a group of bikers raised their glasses in a toast to a little girl named Emma, to her mother who had been brave enough to ask for help, and to the unbreakable bond that had been forged on a desperate night when a mother's love met a warrior's honor and together created something that neither could have achieved alone. A miracle, hard won and freely given, that would echo through the years to come and remind everyone who heard the story. That grace can come from anywhere. Hope can arrive in any form. And sometimes the answer to a desperate prayer wears leather, rides a motorcycle, and carries a heart big enough to save the world.